Toronto. Thanks for having me. So, well, this is the name of the talk, and as you probably guessed, we're going to be talking about making mobile apps with Nuxt today. But before, let's have a look at some applications, shall we? So, whoa, everything, okay, cool. So this is my phone camera app. I'm using Android, so Android users, you probably have a similar one. And iPhone users, you have the iPhone one. But basically, both of those apps are what we call native apps. What we mean by that is that they're developed using the phone-specific programming language. For Android, it's Java or Kotlin. For iOS, it's Swift or Objective-C. So, okay, cool, but as developers, we don't want to code things twice. So what do we do in that case? Do we only code an app for iOS and call it a day? That doesn't really make sense from a marketing point of view, given that the market share between Android and iOS is more or less the same, even here in the US. Well, Canada, sorry, here, but well. So we'll need two apps. And, well, one answer to that issue is Flutter, for example. Flutter is a Dart-based framework developed by Google, and with it, we can create apps for Android and iOS in one go. Google is using it for many of its applications, and here's another app that is also made with Flutter. It's the Philips Hue app, and well, if you don't know Philips Hue, they make like connected light bulbs, and with their mobile app that is developed in Flutter, you can change the color of them. But, well, Flutter and Dart, that's an option. And in this room, well, we're mostly JavaScript developers, aren't we? So, well, we don't know a lot about Dart, or not a lot of us at least. So in that case, you probably heard about React Native. React Native, like Flutter, allows you to create apps for Android and iOS in one go. And here's another camera app that this one is made with React Native. But now you might be thinking, cool, Lucie, that's quite some technologies you got there, but I came here today to hear about Nuxt and Vue. And sure enough, so that's a third camera app. I made this one, and I made it with Nuxt. It comes a bit with a twist with an unusual UI for a camera, and I know you're not here to talk about photography, but really the gist of this app is to take the focus on taking panoramic shots, hence the wide viewfinder, as you can see here. Also, like a real camera, it has a manual and automatic mode, giving greater control over the phone camera sensor, all of that with smooth animations and everything. But, well, getting back to mobile apps, what's interesting here is that none of those camera things are really associated with Nuxt or web development as a whole. Indeed, we know we can make any kind of websites with Vue and Nuxt, but as we just saw, we can also make really capable mobile app with them. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. But before that, I'm Lucie Haberer. I'm coming from France. Well, you'll probably guess it from my accent. And I'm working at Prismic there, which is the CMS, as a developer experience engineer. Also, as you can tell, I've been a lot into cameras lately. Any kind of camera, really. Digital cameras, film cameras, and even weird ones, like this 20 or so years old Nokia phone that is quite an attention grabber at parties. But I also have a lot of fun shooting things with it. I use it to document the small core team retreat we had earlier this year in Bordeaux with the core team I'm a part of. And actually, you know what? I have the phone right here. So let's take a quick minute to just take a selfie with it, and I'll make sure to share it later on. So it doesn't have like a front-facing screen, so it's a bit unusual to take a picture with it, but with some trial and error, I think I managed to get it quite right, and that's quite interesting, the picture it's taking. But, okay, enough with the Nokia phone. Let's get back to my mobile app and to some necessary background story. So I made this app to experience the UI of a real camera prototype called Kirin. Kirin is developed not by a big company, but by a small group of enthusiasts, mainly based in Japan. Earlier this year, they held an event in Tokyo to showcase their work and their ongoing progress on the prototype, and I really wanted to attend this event. But sadly, for various reasons, I couldn't. So this left me quite frustrated because I couldn't experience the real prototype in my own hand, and well, that's how it is. But I didn't end up it there, and I thought to myself, well, what if instead I developed its UI as a mobile app? And that's how it started. That's how I embarked on a journey to build a mobile app. But, well, nowadays, I'm not a mobile app developer. I've had some experience building mobile apps back in my freelance days. And one thing I knew from the get-go is that I didn't want to go native. I know it's quite some work and not an ecosystem I'm really familiar with these days. If I were to build a mobile app nowadays, it would be with JavaScript. So, well, in JavaScript, we talked before about React Native. But I'm not a traitor. I won't write a single line of code of that unholy framework. If I were to build a mobile app with JavaScript, it would be with Vue and Nuxt, as everything should be. So, well, then, how do you build a mobile app with Nuxt? Well, before I give you some answers to that question, you just had Kahoot before, so I have those slides that works a bit like Kahoot. So they allow me to prompt you all about something, and the first thing I want to prompt you about is, have you ever built a mobile app with Nuxt? So please, grab your phone, scan one of those QR codes depending on your answer, and if, like me, you have an old Nokia phone, you can just follow one of those links. It will also submit your vote. But, all right, well, thank you everyone for participating. That's really cool. And as you can see, like, not a lot of us have experience building app with Nuxt. That's cool. For the few of us that have mobile app with Nuxt, like Daniel, that is in front of me right here, I'm sure there will still be things for you to pick up. So, okay, how do you build a mobile app with Nuxt? Well, when building a mobile app with Nuxt, the idea is that we want to end up with a mobile app, but we want the experience of it to feel as much like developing a website with Nuxt. And to do so, in the JavaScript world, we are blessed with Capacitor. So what is Capacitor? Capacitor, it's a native runtime for building web-native apps for Android, iOS, and more. But today, we'll only focus on iOS and Android, because that's already quite a lot. We'll see about that. Also, some of you might be knowing about Apache Cordova. In a way, if you do, we can consider Capacitor as the modern successor of Cordova. Then, how does Capacitor work? It works by leveraging a web view to render the UI of our application, and it connects this web view to the native components of our phone through a bridge. And this is the main difference between a Capacitor app and other kind of apps out there. For example, a fully native app has everything in native code. The UI is written in it, the logic is in it, and has direct access to the native components of the phone. In a React Native app, the UI is in native code. It has been compiled earlier on from React code, but all the logic, all the React reactivity and everything is still run in a JavaScript engine on this side. So React Native apps, like Capacitor, also have a bridge between the JavaScript engine and the native code part of the application. But, well, let's get back to Capacitor, and let's admit something here. Using a web view to render the UI of an application, this has an impact on performance. But in my opinion, phones have gotten so much faster these days that this is way more tolerable now. I don't know about you, but I don't really complain about Chrome being slow on my phone. Or when I do, it's more because the 3G network is too slow, or 4G network now. But, well, in the case of a mobile app, that's not an issue. On the other hand, because we're using a web view to render our UI, this means we can benefit from everything we already know about web development to build our app. We can even share code between our website and our mobile app, and also like benefit from the same developer experience or something that is really similar. In some cases, we'll be able to develop our mobile app in a browser with HTML, and when that's not possible, like with me with my camera app, we can still develop it on our phone directly with HTML. So that's the plan. We're going to build a Nuxt app, and use Capacitor to turn it into a mobile app. We can get started with just a few commands. Here we are initializing Capacitor itself, and then we add iOS and Android as export targets like this. From here, we can just craft our UI with divs and spans, as we love to, put a nice coat of CSS on it, and wait, how did I make anything with the camera of my phone if it's just a web app? Well, remember earlier on, we said that the web view from Capacitor is connected to the native components of our phone through a bridge. And we can leverage that bridge to discuss with the native components of our phone. For example, we can use it to ask for permissions, to fire up a toast, or in my case, to operate the phone camera. And how do we leverage that bridge? Well, let me introduce you to Capacitor plugins. So we have a lot of Nuxt developers in this room, don't we? In Nuxt, we have something that is called Nuxt modules. With Nuxt modules, we have the Tailwind CSS module, the Nuxt image module, let's pick a random one, the Prismic module, and so on and so on. And with Nuxt modules, we can extend our Nuxt app to add endless functionalities to it. On the other end, with Capacitor, we have Capacitor plugins. Similarly to Nuxt modules, with Capacitor plugins, we can extend our Capacitor app to add endless native functionalities to it. And like with Nuxt modules, there's a lot of Capacitor plugins out there. Let's go through some examples. Here we have the Capacitor dialog plugin. With this plugin, we can trigger native dialogues on our phone to ask our users for confirmation. A more abstract one, here is the file system plugin. And with the file system plugin, from our Nuxt app or from our Vue app, we can read and write files to the file system directly. But that's just two of them. And there's a complete list of the official plugins on the Capacitor documentation. And the community also has made a lot of them. When building my camera app, I used many Capacitor plugins. And of course, one of them had to be a camera plugin. So Capacitor provides a camera plugin. When I first saw it, I was like, great, I'll use it, build my app, and call it a day. But as I tried it, I quickly realized that I could only take basic pictures with it. Namely, it offered little to no control over the phone's camera sensor, and in my case, I wanted to have control over the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture of the camera. So, well, I thought, all right, no big deal. Let's see if I can contribute to the plugin to add the functionalities I want. So I went to GitHub, and this is what a Capacitor plugin looks like. First thing we can see is that it's an NPM package. Capacitor plugins are distributed through NPM like any other packages, and we can install them pretty much like any other packages also and use them in our application. Next, we have the Android and the iOS folders. Inside these folders, we'll find the native code responsible for this plugin. So that means inside the Android folder, we have Java or Kotlin, and in the iOS folder, we have Swift or Objective-C code. Finally, we have the SRC folder. Inside the SRC folder, we mainly have a type definition file that looks like this, and this describes the methods this plugin exposes to our application when installed. Here we can see we have the start method, for example, that will start up the camera, a capture method to take a picture, and so on. That's the TypeScript part of the plugin. And now we'll do something a bit scary, but we'll be fine, don't worry. We'll have a peek inside the Android folder. And, well, I'm not here to judge, but Java developers just love to nest their code under dozens of folders. But after digging for a bit, we'll find this camera preview file. And this camera preview file is the entry point of the Capacitor plugin on the Android side, and we have a similar one on the iOS side. From here, if we have a look inside it, we can find the very same methods that were defined in our TypeScript definition file. We can find the start method, the capture method, and so on. So now that we have a better idea of what a Capacitor plugin looks like, well, let's get back to my problem. I wanted to add new features to this plugin. So I thought, well, maybe I could add a few methods. I wanted here and there, roll with it, right? So I looked inside the camera preview file a bit more deeply, and that's where I discovered that the camera part was implemented using the Android hardware camera library. So I went to the Android documentation to learn more about it, and that's where I discovered that sadly the Android hardware camera library does not provide fine-grained control over the phone's camera sensor. So that makes sense, really. When we look at the Android timeline, this library was released alongside Android first release back in 2008. Since then, phone cameras have gotten so much more complex, more powerful, and everything. So this explains the lack of feature of this first camera library plugin. And that's also why people at Android introduced in 2014 a new camera API called Android Hardware Camera 2. This library is a more modern and future-proof camera library for Android, but because it's more powerful and operates more complex cameras, it also has a completely different API. It's notoriously quite hard to implement and to get started with it, so that's why the Capacitor plugin was using the older but much simpler Android hardware camera library. But because of that, this meant that in my case, I couldn't just contribute to the plugin to add new features without rewriting the whole plugin of this newer library. At that point, I really thought I had reached a dead end. Making the camera app I wanted with Nuxt and Capacitor did not seem possible at all, and that's when I considered breaking my oath and started to look at React Native. So React Native, like Capacitor, has its own plugin ecosystem, and there's some camera plugins for it. So I started to review them, only to discover that React Native plugins had the very same limitations Capacitor plugins had. They were either relying on the Android hardware camera library or offered too limited of an API. So, well, after that, I thought I had reached really a dead end in my journey of making a camera app with JavaScript. Unless I make my own Capacitor camera plugin. So, like a true French citizen, I've been really good at complaining about how the community plugins were not enough for my liking. So let's stop the complaints here, and let's actually talk about how we can make our own plugin. But before that, let's have a quick question break. This time, I want to ask you, do you build or use in-house packages at your job, at your company? It can be any kind of packages, doesn't have to be NPM. Maybe you have an authentication library, a UI kit, or something else. So once again, please grab your phone, answer. Thank you so much for taking your time to do that. This will really help me frame the next section of this talk. So, well, that's looking great. Looks like a lot of us have experienced are using and building in-house packages in our company. And that's exactly what we're about to do here. We're going to build our own Capacitor plugin for our very specific need. So how do you build a Capacitor plugin? And I know it's getting a bit niche here, so no worries, I won't do Java code or anything. I will just focus on what's important to know here. And well, first of all, we can get started with this command. This will ask us for a few questions, and from here, we'll end up with a project like that. And we're already pretty familiar with that project structures because it's the very same one that we saw before. It's still an NPM package. We still have our type definition file inside the src folder, and we still have the Android and iOS folder with native code. So from here, this is exactly what I did with my camera app. I initialized the plugin and started to work on Capacitor Camera 2, which is my Capacitor plugin for Android, except it's powered by Android Hardware Camera 2, which was the library I wanted to use. It's only for Android. I know it's a bit of a bummer, but I don't have an iPhone to test it with, so it would have been a nightmare for me to develop the iOS side of it. And well, just remember, it's just a side project of mine, so no string attached. Also, it's written in Java, which differs a bit from the Android community because they prefer to use Kotlin these days. But I worked at a bank before, and I'm more at ease with Java, so I went with Java. And also, it has a broader API for controlling the phone camera sensor, which is what I was after to start with. So here, I know we're talking a lot about native things. But hear me out. What's great about building capacitor plugins of ours is that, sure, we have to write some native code, and this is scary for us JavaScript developers, but the scope of that native code is greatly reduced compared to writing a fully native application. And also, because of that, this means that not everyone in the team has to be familiar with plugin development and native code. Only a few has to be, and this allows you, like from the engineering point of view, to still concentrate most of your effort on building the next app itself. On my end, with some work, I started to have a really capable camera plugin. Here, like I could have like automatic and manual mode. I could take pictures, generate thumbnails, and even manage EXIF data, which is like some kind of information that are attached to pictures. And also had like picture-in-picture support, which was quite fun to play with. On the Nuxt side, I was able to use my plugin and all of that for a really simple use camera composable, which made everything else a breeze. And from here, with, again, some work, I was able to finish and complete the first version of my camera app. I was really happy with it, so I sent it to the people in Japan working on the real camera prototype, and I guess they were pretty happy and excited to experience a version of their work through a mobile device. But more on that in a few. So, well, I know I've been talking a lot about my camera app here, but one thing I want to make sure is that, yeah, like we won't be all making camera apps here. But my story is just an example. You can make any kind of apps with Nuxt and Capacitor, or with just Vue and Capacitor. You can make like mail apps, service apps, e-commerce apps, and so on. And one pattern that is pretty common across mobile apps is that you might want them to have a more native look and feel. Indeed, like you don't want to use material design on iOS, and you don't want iOS design on Android. So earlier on, we saw, for example, that the Capacitor dialog plugin allowed us to trigger native dialog on our app. So this is the Android dialog, but with it, we can trigger the very same dialog for iOS with an iOS design. But what if we want our whole UI, or part of it, to have a native look and feel? Well, in that case, let me introduce you this time to Ionic, which is developed by Capacitor itself. So Ionic is a huge library of components developed by Capacitor, but they are more than components, because each component Ionic provides you with will render differently based on the platform it's running on. This means that an action sheet component, for example, will render on iOS like an action sheet from iOS, and on Android like an action sheet from Android like this. This is all rendered through the same component. Also, Ionic provides you with a comprehensive theming API that allows you to customize a bit the look and feel of those components, and namely to use your own brand color so that your app still feels like it's your app. So from here, do you think you want to use Ionic in your project? Well, in that case, if you're using Nuxt, we have a Nuxt module for that. Well, it's called Nuxt Ionic. It's developed by Daniel Rowe, which, well, you all know about now. And you can get started with it like with all Nuxt modules with just one command. From here, you can learn more about it at ionic.nuxtjs.org, but no rush, you'll get all the links later on. So we've been talking about a lot of things. We talked about Capacitor, Capacitor plugins, how we can even make our own, and Ionic. So let's take the few last minutes we have together to recap about all of that. But the first of all, like, can Nuxt make great mobile apps? Yes, absolutely. It's all made possible thanks to Capacitor, which is a native runtime for making iOS and Android apps. It works by leveraging a web view to render our application. And we know that this is less performant than native code, but with our phone nowadays, this is really tolerable. On the brighter side, because it's a web view, we can benefit from everything we know about web development to build our app, and can share code between our web app and our mobile app and benefit from the same developer experience that will be very similar. When it comes to performing native operations, Capacitor apps are connected to the native components of our phones through a bridge, and this bridge is leveraged through Capacitor plugins. They are really similar to Nuxt modules in a way. There's a lot of first-party plugins out there, and the community also has made a lot of them. Finally, plugins are just NPM packages. In some cases, like me with my camera app, there might not be a plugin tailored just for your use case. In that case, it's not a big deal. You can write your own plugin. And doing so is really great because it grants you access to any native component you can think of. All of that while keeping a reduced scope. And I want to emphasize that here again, but really not everyone in the team has to be familiar with native plugin development and native code. Only a few have to be. Finally, do you want your app to have the look and feel of Android and iOS? Well, in that case, look no further because we have Ionic. It's a large library of customizable components that will render differently based on the platform they are running on. If you're using Nuxt, we have a Nuxt module for that. It's called Nuxt Ionic. You can get started with it with just one command. So that's all from me. But on my end, I'm really heading to Japan next year to meet the team behind the real camera prototype that my app portrayed. And we'll surely hack a few things together. So thank you so much for listening and coming to my talk. You can find everything about it at lucie.red/Toronto. And well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucie. That was amazing. It was taking me back several years where I worked on Ionic, because Ionic's up to, what, version 8 or so now, and I was way back in 3, but it, it saved me from having to learn how to write Java code and Swift code and all of that. We have some extra time here, so does anybody out there have any questions for Lucie?
Hey, yeah, I was just wondering about routing. Like with Nuxt, you think about page-based routing, and I'm wondering how that kind of translates into the app world.
Okay, so like in an app, you have like pages basically. So it works really similarly to what you have with a regular website. However, like in some cases, you might have like drawers, like menus, like nested inside each other, like in a settings page or things like that. In that case, Ionic provides you with a lot of components to assist you with that and have something that looks and feels really like a regular app. But all in all, like there's no really strong surprise, and you can just develop one page for every screen of your application, or use like some Ionic components to have like transitions and things like that are like a native app.
Anyone else back here?
Hi, Lucie. Oh, wonderful presentation. I loved it. It took me back to the days when I used to work in Ionic and Capacitor. But then a lot of problem that I faced, my team faced at the time, was looking at these edge cases like camera, for example. But for us, it was Bluetooth and trying to run an in-app browser within an app itself. So these kind of edge cases, we didn't have native code developers in our team. So developing these plugins was quite hard, and even debugging these apps natively is quite hard through Xcode or even Android Studio, because you don't really get the logs properly. So it's like a map that you need to find out through the logs that those IDs provide. It's been a couple of years since I've touched it again. So what are your thoughts on these problems? If you don't necessarily want to go through the plugin route, for us, what we did at that point is we made some custom code in the custom native code after it was built up. Then that was added in once the build got completed after Capacitor did its job. But then has the community evolved a lot. Another challenge that we had is, unlike the web world, the app world has a lot of different types of screens. iPhone has this small square on the top, rectangle on top, and so if you're developing natively, these screen sizes are already solved for. But then these apps would behave very differently if you're adding something weird things into it. So these kind of edge cases, was such a hindrance for us, especially since we didn't have native developers on our team. So how do you see those problems?
Okay. Yeah, there's different approaches to those issues. One thing you can do, like when it's like a light problem, for example, in my phone app, I wanted to know the orientation of the phone, like to update the UI accordingly. And I didn't really find like a plugin that was fitting my liking. But because, again, it's like just a web app, you can use the device orientation API from that is available like on any browser. And I hacked my way through that to like actually get the device orientation without even relying on native components about that. So for a lot of like small things, you can like find a way with just using like web standards to make those works. In some cases, like for example, like with the peel on iOS, like the action bar on Android, I don't have experience with what the ecosystem looked like a few years ago, but I know that today, for example, in my camera app, I wanted to hide the action bar, and I was able to find really quickly a plugin that just like hided it for me. So I believe the ecosystem from Capacitor has like grown up, and like there's a lot more plugins for like a lot of various edge cases that can support you and prevent you from like writing your own custom plugin every time you want to do something like a bit specific. But yeah, like for example, like if tomorrow you want to make like a mobile app that integrates really deeply with like an Apple Watch, for example, there's like a watch plugin from Capacitor, but it will likely be too limited for what you want to do. So in that case, you'll find yourself in a bit like the same scenario I was myself with the camera app, and you'll have to maybe write your own Apple Watch plugin for Capacitor.
Great. Any other questions for Lucie? All right, one thing, Lucie, I was curious about, I thought it was very cool that you sent your progress to the folks that were working on some of those native features, and I'm wondering, did that end up helping you in the long run? Did you end up getting more feedback that changed the way you approached the project?
Well, I'm maybe like, well, not really. I really wanted to complete like a first version of the app before I sent anything outside the world. So I had to resolve all of those myself. Maybe they would have helped a bit, but when it comes to creating your own camera prototype and everything, you're not even dealing with JavaScript or anything in terms of code. There's some embedded frameworks and languages that are made for that. So they wouldn't have had a lot of ideas of how to solve that, I believe.
That makes sense, yeah. And so it seems like you eventually, if you're going to push one of these plugins a little bit further, then you get out of the box with it, that you're going to have to learn a little bit of native code. And do you feel like the approach you'd recommend for other folks is just tinker and kind of learn on the fly as you go? Or do you feel like there are resources that you have found where you might start with some base level knowledge about that?
Okay. Well, Capacitor has its own tutorials for how to get started and write your own plugins, but this won't teach you Java or Swift in any greater length. One thing that helped me a bit, because my Java skills are still a bit rusty, I haven't written Java in quite some time before that. So one thing that is really helpful to me is to look at what others are doing in terms of code. So when I wanted to move things around in my plugin, I looked how they are doing it in this other plugin that does something similar to me. And so I inspired for a lot from that.
That's great. Great advice. All right, let's give it up for Lucie Haberer.